Welcome to the Fighting Parson and the Unauthorized Preacher, a lecture on the lives of Thomas Allen and Samuel Ely. We'll begin with the life of the Reverend Thomas Allen, also known as the Fighting Parson, and the reason for that will become clear once we get to the Battle of Bennington. Allen grew up in New England, steeped in the tradition of the New Lights. His father was an associate of Jonathan Edwards, who was the leading figure in the First Great Awakening. So he would have been very familiar with that particular movement or sub-denomination within Congregationalism. He graduated Harvard, 33rd in his class, which would be a very impressive accomplishment today. However, at the time, his class consisted of 47 other students, so that is sort of towards the bottom. But he was ordained nonetheless, and officially allowed to preach. This education would have set him up for a privileged position within New England society. He was invited to Pittsfield to preach after, a trial period, a competitive trial period, and a vote of the congregation. He was offered £60 per year to start, with an eventual increase to 80. And additionally, over the first 3 years of his residence in the town, he was offered £90 to get set up. So we can see that, this is a position not only of prominence, but also one of, comfort. Allen's preaching is typical of this New Light style. He emphasizes sort of a more sort of emotional approach, and similar to other sermons that we'll see later on in the lecture, a couple that come down to us, which are actually eulogies, emphasize the value of suffering and trials and the importance of submission to God's will. He also stresses the important role of faith in providing reason over solace in these sort of trying situations. He also brings politics into his sermons. This was a increasingly frequent occurrence, apparently, and one that upset some of the more conservative members of his congregation. He really didn't shy away from bringing politics to the pulpit. And, characteristically, when he eulogized his son, Thomas Allen Jr., we can see a quote here. He brought in politics. Quote, "He accordingly ever united with those who fought the support of our happy Constitution and the present administration of our national government." So here, we'll get into this a little later on, but, during the Revolution, Allen was a very firm Whig, and then during sort of the early federal period, he actually opposed the Federalists and really aligned himself very strongly and outspokenly with the Jeffersonians. So during the Revolution, Allen's politics really take center stage, and he becomes active in local politics. He actually chairs the Pittsfield Committee of Correspondence, which places him essentially in a leading role of revolutionary government. He also organized a group known as the Berkshire Constitutionalists that were formed to oppose merchant power, which was very strong in the eastern half of the state of Massachusetts, and to reject the revolutionary government's authority in the Berkshires. So not only is he on board with tossing out British authority, when you have some of these early governments being set up, he allies himself with a faction that's opposed to the wealthy merchant classes at the time. So they actually organize their own courts, and generally these courts are created with an eye toward showing leniency towards debtors. A compassion for the poor would be typical of Allen's outlook for the rest of his life. But let's go ahead and advance the clock somewhat to the Battle of Bennington, 1777. We have a tradition that comes down to us that Allen took another prominent role here at the battle. He actually leads several of the men from his town, his congregation, to Stark, and I'll provide a quote here from the history of Pittsfield, penned in the middle of the 19th century. Quote, "Among the reinforcements from Berkshire County came a clergyman with a portion of his flock, resolved to make bare the arm of flesh against the enemies of his country. Before daylight on the morning of the 16th, he addressed the commander as follows: We, the people of Berkshire, have been frequently called upon to fight, but have never been led against the enemy. We have now resolved, if you will not let us fight, never to turn out again." General Stark asked him if he wished to march then, when it was dark and rainy. "No," was the answer, "not just this minute." Then continued Stark, "If the Lord should once more give us sunshine, and I do not give you fighting enough, I will never ask you to come again." So, that sort of exchange, well, perhaps not verbatim, would be typical of Allen's temperament. When it came to the fighting, we actually know exactly where Allen was, with quite a few other men from the Berkshires. He was actually attacking the Tory fort. And again, we have a rich tradition there. Supposedly, before the attack proper commenced, Allen mounted a stump and harangued the loyalists at this position, demanding that they lay down their arms, because he felt it was his Christian duty to offer them the opportunity. Now, this is a very gracious offer considering how the battle turns out, but it's one that's not accepted. And again, returning to the history of Pittsfield, quote, "There's Parson Allen, let's pop him," exclaimed someone who perhaps still smarted from the lash of the minister's plain preaching, and, although a few were of a more merciful mood, a shower of bullets whistled around him, riddling the tree on which he stood, but sparing his person. So the Tories were not of a mind to surrender to Allen. Allen actually does go on to present one of the first published accounts of the Battle of Bennington. It appears in the Connecticut Current, August 25th. His report is very similar to Stark's, with some differences, and one notable error. He actually names Skene as commander of the British detachment there in place of Baum. And he concludes with, a very memorable turn of phrase, quote, "This action, which redounds so much to the glory of the great Lord of the heavens and God of armies, affords the Americans a lasting monument of the divine power and goodness, and a most powerful argument of love to and trust in God." So he sees the battle really as divine judgment, um, and an example of providence at work in the world, um, which was probably a fairly common sentiment at the time. Now, there are some later controversies to delve here with Allen. During the Revolutionary War, being a fervent Whig obviously is going to turn out very well for you. Um, he's he's a very early adopter of revolutionary rhetoric. He believes this rhetoric very earnestly and advocates for it. But after the war, when America remains fairly divided politically, there's not going to be this one singular event that decides political conflicts like the war. Um, you're going to have political parties form. And as I mentioned, Allen really didn't shy away from presenting, mixing politics with his preaching. And more, this sort of rubbed his congregation the wrong way. So after the war, the congregational clergy who sided with the sort of old Calvinist tradition, more often than not, became Federalists. Allen was one of only 3 preachers in that tradition, that specific congregational tradition, in the entire state of Massachusetts to reject those politics. So he stands as sort of a strange example of what would have been considered a religious stance and political stance that really weren't supposed to mix. Immediately after the war, he is completely scandalized by the acceptance of small-time Tories back into local society and politics. Um, Curiously, he does not support Shays' rebellion, and this is just sort of typical of Allen. He doesn't quite fit neatly into either the conservative or radical molds. Um, he sees Shays' rebellion, it's really, I guess, a step too far, and for failing to support it, he actually receives threatening letters, and according to tradition, that necessitates that he go about armed. So similar to how he might have kept a musket at the pulpit during the Revolutionary War. After the war, he's still packing, but it's for a completely different reason. Now, one of the major points of contention in the post-war period is the construction of a new church. So his congregation is split over a 1791 proposal to create a new sort of more elaborate meeting house. And they don't see this as something that they want to pay for, um, or something that they should pay for. So actually, many of the congregation break away and join with Baptists or Methodists, and this is unfortunately one of the many divisions or fault lines after the war that starts breaking up these congregations. Um, Basically, in the pre-revolutionary period, um, congregational churches really had the power to compel people um, to financially support them, and that authority is going to be on the wane, and in the early portion of the 19th century, it's going to basically be a thing of the past. but this is an early example of people bucking against that. Allen also goes on to found a newspaper. So actually 10 years before he dies, so this is in his relative old age, um, he calls up a nephew to help him found the Pittsfield Sun. And this is a very strongly Jeffersonian paper. Later 19th century histories, there's a debate back and forth as to exactly how involved he was in, some of the editorials that appear in this paper. Um, but, safe to say he has some involvement. We have some quotes here, some of the words of Allen on federalism. Quote, "Federalism is the same the world over, the same in every age, in every clime. It has filled the four quarters of the world with distress and misery, made the most dreadful ravages among the human race, turned this once delightful paradise into a field of blood. By her sorceries have all nations been deceived, and in her was found the blood of the prophets and old saints, and of all that were slain upon the earth. Let us inquire what it is, and show it to be wicked in principle, temper, and practice. Federalism consists in love of arbitrary power and enmity to the civil and religious rights of mankind. It is hostile to the character of Jehovah, the love of our neighbor. It is a leprosy on the body politic, destructive of human peace, order, and happiness, self as its idol. It essentially consists in selfishness." So those are very inflammatory words, considering, at any given time, half or more of his congregation, you would expect them to be Federalists. So it's very difficult to go on in these circumstances. There's an election in 1807. He delivers a sermon sort of praising recent Federalist defeats. Again, this splits his congregation. And as I mentioned, he does pass away in 1810. His legacy is an interesting one. It's still preserved. He's a fairly well-known figure locally and regionally. You have various monuments to him. So you actually have a plaque in sort of the modern church in Pittsfield, noting him as their first minister. You have a very clearly marked, conspicuous grave. This is not someone who's lost in the shadows of history. He is remembered. Unfortunately, as of this publication of this lecture, I'm sorry to say the first church in Pittsfield is actually slated for sale. Even before the pandemic hit, they were in some trouble. So sadly, the modern building, which is actually the third on that site, and sort of traces its lineage back to that original meeting house and that original congregation, is going to be sold. So its future at this time is actually up in the air. However, the memory of Thomas Allen as their first preacher, I think it's safe to say, will stay with us. Let's move on to Samuel Ely. Just a quick note on pronunciation. I've heard it said Ely. However, I am aware that some people prefer Eli or Eli. As far as I know, the correct pronunciation of that surname is Ely. And we begin this slide, actually, you'll note, without an image. There is no portrait of Samuel Ely, um, because his memory really has not been preserved in the same way as Allen's, um, and there's some reasons for that, which we'll get into here. Um, so Samuel Ely is born 1740. He's a contemporary of Allen's. Rather than attending Harvard, he goes to Yale. Um, he passes away perhaps in 1797. That's the last known historical evidence of his existence. In 1796, he threatens to burn down General Knox's house and poison him. We'll get to that. And in 1797, he actually leaves a note on the rostrum of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and we'll get to that. Um, After that point, we really don't know what became of him. It's possible he lives for a few more years into his old age. Given his activities at that point in history, it's also possible he was murdered. Um, so we'll evaluate either possibility in just a moment here. But like Allen, Ely associates with the New Lights. He is invited to preach in 1769 at in Somers, Connecticut, and his tenure there is going to be very brief. Unlike Allen, who remains in that community for upwards of half a century, Ely's out by 1771. He is just as bombastic and inflammatory as Allen, if not more so, but that community really was not receptive. Once they sort of got the full measure of the man, some of the more conservative elements in that congregation basically told him, it's time for you to leave. Now, what kind of preacher was Ely? Well, we have, again, a few surviving sermons, and they're similar in tone to Allen's, but they are much more concerned with, I guess, real world applications and how a Christian ought to conduct themselves, on the basis of biblical precedent. So we'll begin by just sort of diving into a few of these in a little more detail than we did with Allen's sermons or eulogies. The first is published 1771, delivered 1770, so it's pre-revolutionary, but it's going to have certain revolutionary tones and undercurrents in it nevertheless. So Ely begins by writing, "You may think it strange that I should appear in print being young and so much despised by the great and by the fashionable world." So right off the bat, he's sort of letting us know what we're in store for. He's going to be sort of railing against the great and the fashionable. So the first sermon, titled "On the Patience of Job," argues for a rational submission to God's will, as our afflictions in the end are for the benefit of the sinner. His sermon outlines what could be interpreted as sort of a reverse gospel of prosperity. How do you know you're among the elect? Well, if you're suffering, God is testing you, and if you're being tested, it's for the good of your soul. So if you're living in comfort, watch out. Um, quote, great trials and disasters are evincing arguments of their good estate, and a visible assurance that they belong to the sacred select progeny and family of God. Quote, for many times his chosen lead a voluptuous life without disturbance, become encircled with riches and honor, softened with pleasures, charmed with enticing objects, live riotous and luxurious, become slaves to sensualities, and in prosperity settle down upon their lees, careless and secure, as though they were ripening for perdition, and preserved for final vengeance. So it's a very interesting interpretation. And for anyone who's not familiar with the book of Job, it's a book of the Old Testament where essentially a righteous man is um, beset by a series of terrible reverses of good fortune by Satan, essentially at the instigation of God. Satan says, okay, Job is righteous now, but if you take away everything that he has, surely he'll curse you. And God says, well, go ahead and find out. And that leads to a series of, terrible things happening to Job. And throughout them all, he sort of remains a righteous man. So this is Samuel Ely's focus for these particular sermons. And this is also, I think, a model for his life. He really does sort of live his life later on as if he were Job himself. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. So he has another sermon, part 2 to the first, Job's appeal from the judgment of men to the judgment of God, where he essentially argues that you do not need to convince men, or I guess sort of by implication governments, of your honor, and that there's essentially a higher authority, a higher court by which you will be judged. Quote, "'Tis a high honor for a man, when accused unjustly of a crime, to appear before an earthly bar, and there defend his innocency, far more so than to hide and shelter himself from trial for fear of being found guilty." So as far as Ely's concerned, you must defend yourself when accused. It's incumbent upon you as someone who is righteous to actually make the case for yourself. So there's some interesting theology there, and some interesting politics as well. Again, you can see sort of how the two are mixed here. In 1772, because of his preaching, he's barred from the pulpit. So he's actually no longer allowed officially to preach for congregational churches. That doesn't stop him, however. He forges some papers so he can preach as a Presbyterian in Pennsylvania. He later sort of begins preaching itinerantly, as a, quote, unchurched preacher in western Massachusetts and southern Vermont. And it's during this period of his, itinerancy that he's invited to preach in Wilmington, Vermont. And he's actually granted 100 acres of land there to establish himself, March 3rd, 1777. So around the time that he is sort of just getting his feet under him, I believe also at the time his wife has given birth to their third daughter. He fights at Bennington. So you have the Battle of Bennington. And Ely turns out to fight, but in a very particular or peculiar way. He's actually going to fight without being associated with any organized company of militia. Um, so he fights, on his own hook, so to speak. Um, and the evidence for his participation in the Battle of Bennington essentially comes from uh, accusations later on, and actually a court martial, that he illegally helped himself to some plunder on the field, um, and we'll get into that. But essentially, he fights at Bennington. He makes out very well for himself. The items he makes off with are fairly valuable. Um, but it's fairly clear that he is not welcome um, by the authorities here. He's actually caned, severely beaten by Joseph Fay. And if you're familiar with the history of the town of Bennington, that is a very prominent family. So we have a Fay beating Ely so badly that he's forced to forced to leave in order to recover. Um, so after the battle here, we have a war of words fought very publicly. Um, a lot of the accusations that are made against Ely are actually printed in the papers. So William Williams prints this quote: "Run away from headquarters about the 5th instant with the following valuable articles. One infamous, loquacious Samuel Ely of Somers, formerly an itinerant preacher, an auctioneer of the gospel. This inhuman, plundering villain may be distinguished by his being constantly found clothed with a face of brass, armed with a lying tongue, in his own vindication and defense when most guilty." So he goes on to list some of the things he made off with, including a gold diamond ring, um, and other articles too numerous to mention. So this appears in the papers, and it is answered fairly quickly. We actually have Samuel Robinson coming to Ely's defense. Quote, "Mr. Samuel Ely, the preacher, who was in the 2 bloody battles at Bennington, and behaved with the greatest honor, valiantry, and courage in both actions, and all the other accounts did, when desired, appear before the court of inquiry, and made a handsome defense relative to the plunder he had taken. As he said, what he had taken was at the point of the sword, as a volunteer for his groaning, bleeding country. And he further said, he supported himself and lived upon his own money while in camp, and was at no charge to this country." We have some other witnesses from Wilmington, Vermont, not only defending Ely, but casting aspersions on the service of Williams. Quote, "And what adds to the guilt of Williams in his cruel and abusive conduct towards Mr. Ely is his boldly and openly denying that he ever ordered Mr. Ely to be advertised. But, as he did prove a coward in leaving the field in time of action, so Mr. Ely taking his place and command, the world will at once judge why he wickedly advertised Mr. Ely. We therefore declare that Williams, whom the soldiers universally called Plunder Master General, acted like himself and abused Mr. Ely without the least cause or reason." So that's very interesting. This isn't borne out in any other documents, but we do have sort of a hint that not only did Ely fight at Bennington, but he might have actually sort of been compelled to take a leadership role in the battle, um, which is fascinating. In which case, he might have actually been, responsible for the ultimate victory in the battle in part. The Committee of Safety of Wilmington, Vermont, also published a card in which they say, "We all know that General Stark said if he had 5,000 men, such men as Mr. Ely, he would drive Burgoyne and his army to the devil." So here we have a quote attributed to Stark praising Ely. So who's to be believed? Some of the prominent figures casting aspersions on this rabble rouser, or basically the rank and file who seem mostly to rally to his defense. So at this point, I would like to tie things back to those two sermons. Quote, "Yea, and even engage to vindicate and justify themselves as Job did, and not suffer their name and character to rot, but to use every requisite method to make their name and persons appear reputable, as Job never failed to use all expedients to this end." So my supposition is that Ely would have been thrilled to have faced these charges, because it would have given him the opportunity to sort of basically ham it up and stand in as sort of a Job-like figure, unfairly accused, coming to his own defense. Now, Ely's later life after the Revolution, well, during and after the Revolution, is just as contentious as Allen's, and it's very fascinating because there are certain parallels and differences actually with some of the activities of groups with a clearer link to the battle, such as the Green Mountain Boys. So Ely's actually going to stage a rebellion or an insurrection, whatever you want to term it, prior to Shays. Some historians have actually sort of dubbed this sort of the forerunner to Shays. And, what are the circumstances of this rebellion? Well, Massachusetts in 1780, after a lengthy and bitter drafting process, comes up with a constitution. It had to ratify with 2/3 support of the eligible electorate. However, they claim that support. However, only 42% of voters actually accepted it without amendment. So most voters, especially those in western Massachusetts, objected to the document as drafted and presented. And their objections basically centered around fears that it concentrated power into the hands of a few and made for a very strong executive. Also, in 1781, we have a worsening of the economic situation, especially for farmers. High taxes, scarce money, falling prices for their land really combine to put them in a pinch. And the judiciary at this time is basically seen as a pawn of the elite. To quote Ely, quote, "The attorneys, sheriffs, and all officers should be sacrificed, their bodies given to the fowls of the air, the beasts of the field." Things get so bad that Ely actually raises a mob April 4th, 1782, to shut down the Court of Common Pleas in Northampton, Massachusetts, and attributed to him as a, quote, Come on, my brave boys, we will go to the woodpile and get clubs enough to knock their gray wig off and send them out of the world in an instant. So not only are they sort of demonstrating against the courts, shutting down the courts, they're threatening personal violence to the judges and attorneys. So this is clearly not going to go without some sort of response from the government of Massachusetts. So Ely is arrested in Hadley. He's imprisoned in Springfield. However, he's released in June 12th by a mob action. The ringleaders of that mob are themselves captured and then freed. Um, basically, you know, on the supposition that once freed, they're going to turn in Ely. Um, that is really not the case. Ely does actually sort of dodge the authorities for a period, but it's worth asking, you know, what led to his success in forming this mob, because he tries similar things in Vermont and Maine with mixed results. But why was this successful? Well, a significant portion of the mob was actually composed of veterans who had fought earlier in the Revolution and were upset that when the state taxed them, the state would not accept its own, what amounts to IOUs that were given to these men for their service in payment of those taxes. So he's got sort of this ready-made built-in base that he can sort of tap into. So after this affair, eventually everyone's pardoned with the exception of Ely, and a committee, including Samuel Adams, actually travels through the area of western Massachusetts, hearing people's complaints and trying to tamp things down without much success, because they really don't do anything to address the complaints. It's not long after this that Ely actually finds himself, he's banned from the state of Vermont. He gets into Vermont. He's kind of crossing the border pretty freely, but he goes into Vermont. He actually sides with a Yorker mob. A Yorker association, smallholders who are now actually objecting to these the land patents of some of their, quote unquote betters in the state of Vermont. And how do they do that? Well, what options are available to them? Well, Vermont's an independent republic at this point, broken away from sort of the arbitrary bad government of New York. Well, they go back to New York. They appeal to sort of New York authority in the hopes that it might advantage them. And Ely actually throws his lot in with them. And we do have a document here that sort of runs through some of his activities and some of the charges that were leveled against him. Quote, aforesaid to complete, perfect, and render effectual, did on the 10th day of July, 1782, and at divers other times at Wilmington, aforesaid, meaning Ely, say and assert, affirm, and pronounce, and with a loud voice declare these false, malicious, seditious English words following, that is to say, quote, the state of Vermont is a damned state, and the act for the purpose of raising 10 shillings upon every 100 acres of land is a cursed act, and they that made it are a cursed body of men, and that, in further prosecution of his malice, he did then and there publicly declare that, quote, the general or Supreme Court aforesaid were a pack of villains, and that if no other person would undertake to overturn or destroy the government of Vermont, he, the said Ely would do it. And he had got that in his pocket, which would overset them. So, already on sort of the lam from Massachusetts authorities, he is now going to be banished from Vermont for a period of 18 months. They kick him out. He is forced back into Massachusetts, where he's imprisoned in Boston and released on bail, £1,000 paid by his brother, and thereafter relocates to Maine. Now, in for a time, Ely actually does make appeals for his release, and he makes there's some rather strange reasons. He's basically appealing for humane release, and I think some of the exaggeration here really does again tie back into the life of Job. Quote, he says, quote, "I'm full of boils and putrefied sores all over my body." Um, he's basically saying that he's in such a poor condition, that he actually, his skin is broken out. He can't actually change his clothing. He's so in so much pain and distress because of all these boils and sores. Whether that's true or not, it is a perfect analog with the story of Job, who, after losing his possessions, is afflicted with this plague of boils and sores. So again, is this a rhetorical flourish? Did this actually happen to him while in prison? It's hard to say. So Eli is banished from Vermont. Let's move on to the final chapter in his life, which unfolds in Maine, which at this time was actually a part of Massachusetts. So he really was not supposed to be there. He's actually violating the terms of his parole by settling in this particular territory. But we'll just begin by saying that Maine already had a number of settled farmers prior to its main frenzy of post-war land grants. So, beginning in 1783, you can see by the chart there that the number of available acres begins to drop precipitously. But at that time, you already had 56,000 settlers, Ely among them. And this frenzy to grant the land, usually to the wealthy and the prominent, would then sort of squeeze anyone they found on their property who had settled things on sort of maybe a less than by the book legal basis. Leads to a lot of conflict. Conflict with who? Well, specifically Knox of revolutionary fame. We know him as sort of the hero who brought the cannons of Ticonderoga south in support of the siege of Boston. Today he enjoys a very sterling reputation. At the time, though, a lot of small landowners in what is now the modern day state of Maine really cursed him as a villain. And Ely actually sort of spearheads some of these agitations. So again, he uses violence, intimidation to oppose Knox and some of his claims in Maine. He actually tears down a dam operated by his land agent there. He beats another ally of Knox's with a stick. Um, and really, because he's so far removed from a lot of the Massachusetts, or, the Bay authorities up there in Maine, for a period, he's actually really able to get away with quite a bit. Um, Things really begin to sort of take a turn for the worse when a bill passes, which Knox uses to dispossess farmers who settled their land um, during and after the Revolution. In March of 1796, because of Ely's outspoken opposition to this, and other issues, a writ is actually crafted for his arrest at the insistence of Knox. And during his time, basically as an outlaw, um, rather than keep a low profile, he actually he actually begins a period in his life here where he's producing quite a bit of writing, and the titles are attention grabbers, to say the least. Um, so these are basically pamphlets that are written in really the same style as his sermons. They're organized in much the same way. Um, in the unmasked Nabob of Hancock County, um, Nabob, as I understand it, that's sort of a derogatory term for someone who's wealthy. Ely questions the right of the General Council to make any land grant to Knox, or at all, really. He alleges overlaps with other grants, irregularities in the surveying. He suggests that the fees imposed on settlers under the patent are burdensome. Quote, the last penny from the dying poor, um, he wrenches the last penny from the dying poor by his chicanery and fines. He also includes a rather humorous last will and testament, supposed to be, Knox's testament. He's constantly needling Knox for being old at this point and near death. Quote, I will to my wife, Squire Wheaton's 2 mills, as soon as I can, by art and craft, get a quitclaim deed of them. So basically, this phony will, it's satire. It's basically presented as Knox sort of enumerating all the things he's going to steal from the settlers and give to his sort of morally questionable relatives. We also have an appeal of the 2 counties of Lincoln and Hancock from the forlorn hope or mount of distress to the general court or to all the world in 1796. Here again, he cites biblical precedent, the prophet Amos, who preached basically against the excesses of the wealthy in the biblical kingdom of Judah. Quote, the poor are sold for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes. Basically, this really dives into sort of the nitty-gritty of Knox's patent. He comes into possession of the Waldo patent through marriage to Lucy Flucker, who herself claimed the land through a convoluted chain of inheritance that, again, Ely finds questionable. And according to Ely, he's demanding that settlers pay $2 to $4 per acre just to basically be confirmed in their land. Ely advises the creation of a committee to draft resolves for submission to the general court. He's got some resolves in this pamphlet. Quote, in a solemn manner, we resolve to defend the Constitution of this state with all its civil officer at the expense of life and fortune, offices, at the expense of life and fortune, unless 'tis where our rights are unjustly invaded by the unjust influence of land jobbers to excite civil officers to destroy and ruin our families, in which case our virtuous constitution does not operate. So essentially, he says, we can pick and choose not only the form of our constitution through democratic methods, but whether we're going to observe it or not. And this poses really a unacceptable challenge to civil authority. He demands an end to surveying, sales, and ejectments. And, he goes on to say, quote, remember the intention and purity of our Constitution was made to defend the poor from the rich, the weak from the powerful, the industrious from the rapacious, the peaceable from the violent, the tenants from the lords, and all from their superiors. And then he goes on to cite the example of Vermont. This is basically his fallback if all else fails. Quote, but if the court will be deaf to our cries and afford us no relief, let us adopt the Vermont plan by voting ourselves into a separate state, form as they did an assembly of our own, nullify and vacate patents as they did, and then peace will reign triumphant, and there will be none in the province of Maine to make them afraid. Well, Maine will get its own statehood, but the issues that Ely is agitating for are going to, sort of remain for years to come. When last we hear from Ely, his parting shots to the authorities really ramp up sort of the rhetorical devices that he's been using all along. Here we have the deformity of a hideous monster discovered in the province of Maine by a man in the woods looking after liberty. And this is published in 97, close to his supposed death. He compares the general court to Ahab, one of the evil kings of the Bible who worshiped Baal and consorted with Jezebel. He calls into question all the deeds that these speculators are claiming a right to. He basically has this theory that as anyone who settled prior to the revolution settled on King's land, which was open for them to do so, they have a legal right to that land. He goes on to say, quote, if we must be killed, we will die like men, raising the specter of a civil war. He then goes on to say that really we were no better off, or that we were better off under the king. Quote, we are at present under despots who take our liberty from us with as much arbitrary power as the despots of Europe. How may the Tories laugh at us and call us fools for our pains? He goes on to say, quote, if you take away my head, do it fairly and above board. Let me have a high scaffold that all may see a martyr die. This to me suggests that at this point, Ely has some reason to fear for his life, and is advising the authorities to make his execution public. So it really is just speculation how he met his end, but it is fair to say that he had no shortage of enemies. As I mentioned, his final petition is made on January 2nd, 1797. He sneaks into the House of Representatives and leaves it on the Speaker's podium. And this manifesto was titled, quote, the last petition of an innocent man, a plaintive worm, involved in one continual round of distress, miseries, and torture, or a man persecuted in the bowels of a free republic by a systematic junto of luxurious sons. So at this point, I really don't need to provide any synopsis. The title is long enough. the reader can get an idea of what was said. Um, and so, as I mentioned, it's here that the documentary trail for Ely goes cold. Um, and unlike Allen, whose memory has been preserved, Ely's has really all but been obliterated. There's been a few recent publications by the Massachusetts Historical Society in the 2010s about him, but really there's not a whole lot to commemorate his memory. There's no grave you can visit, there's no plaque. There's not even any place names. Originally, you know, Ely was basically situated near Saturday Cove, north of Ely's Brook, which has since been renamed Shaw's Brook. So you don't even, his name has literally been erased um, from the maps as well as history, figuratively. So the two figures do make an interesting comparison. Allen and Ely both preached as Congregationalists. They led men in battle. They raised mobs against the legally constituted governments of their time, not just the royal government, um, but the American government. Um, and they are part of a large tradition of agrarian radicals who sort of take their cue, their egalitarianism, their leveling tendencies, as might be said in the period, from the Bible, from scriptural authority and their own interpretation. It's interesting to speculate. There did these two men meet at the Battle of Bennington? We have no evidence that they did. Um, but for a time, the threads of both of their lives were joined. And I think they're both worth remembering as important religious and political figures. Thank you.